There is a moment that visits almost every person who has lived a long life. It rarely announces itself. It doesn't come with warning signs or dramatic music. It arrives quietly, sometimes in a hospital room, but just as often in the space right after silence, when a house that used to be full is suddenly permanently quiet. Maybe it's an empty chair at the kitchen table. Maybe it's a phone that no longer rings the way it used to. And in that stillness, something rises up from somewhere deep inside you. Not sadness exactly, but a question. A gentle, aching question that you didn't invite and can't quite put down. Why did I wait? You are not the only one who has asked it. In hospital rooms and quiet living rooms, in nursing homes and empty houses across this country, people who have lived 7, 8, 9 decades speak the same words in different shapes. Almost none of them wish they had bought more things. Almost none of them wish they had worked more hours. What they wish, more than almost anything else, is that they had waited less. Today, we are going to talk about why. If you've ever felt that quiet ache, the sense that something is unfinished, something you meant to say or do but somehow never got around to, you're about to understand exactly where it comes from. Because there is one regret that surfaces again and again in the hearts of people who have lived long enough to look back with honest eyes. It doesn't wear just one face. It shows up as an unsent letter, an apology never spoken, a trip never taken, a moment of joy quietly postponed for a someday that kept moving further away. Today, we're going to walk through 9 of these quiet postponements, the small, ordinary places where later stole what should have belonged to today. And by the time we're finished, I hope you'll understand something important. It is not too late for you. Not yet. Let's start with the one that hurts the most to admit. Think of someone right now, a parent, a sibling, an old friend, maybe even a spouse who is still sitting in the next room. Is there something you have felt for them for years but never actually said out loud? Most people carry at least one of these. Not because the love wasn't real, it was often the realest thing in the room, but because saying it felt unnecessary or awkward or somehow too large for an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. You told yourself there would be another dinner, another holiday, another phone call where the timing would finally feel right. And for a long time you were correct. There was another dinner. There was another call. Until one year there wasn't. Psychologists have a name for the tendency to assume tomorrow will look just like today. But you don't need a textbook to recognize it. You've lived it. When someone is a permanent fixture in your life, a mother who has always been there, a best friend from childhood, a spouse who has shared your bed for 40 years, your mind quietly files them under always. And always doesn't require urgency. Why would you rush to say something to someone who isn't going anywhere? Except, eventually, everyone is going somewhere. And so are you. Many people raised in earlier generations were taught that love is something you demonstrate, not something you announce. You show it by cooking the meal, fixing the roof, driving 3 hours in the rain to show up at the hospital. And that kind of love is real and it matters deeply. But it isn't the same as hearing the words. Actions tell someone what you do. Words tell them what they mean to you. Somewhere along the way, many of us decided the second one was optional or sentimental, or simply understood without needing to be spoken. Maybe it's your son, 3 states away, who calls every Sunday at the same hour. You talk about the weather, about his job, about how his kids are doing in school. It's a good call, a comfortable one. But it ends the same way it always does. A quick, all right, talk soon, love you, bye. Said so fast it barely has time to mean anything before the line goes quiet. And afterward, some part of you wonders what would happen if just once you slowed that sentence down. Whether he'd be surprised. Whether he's been waiting for you to. Or maybe it isn't your son at all. Maybe it's the person sitting across the table from you right now. Tonight, the one you've been married to for 45 years. Somewhere around year 10 or 15. I love you quietly shifted from something you said out loud to something you both simply assumed. An old habit worn so smooth by repetition that it stopped needing to be spoken, the way you stopped noticing the hum of a refrigerator you've lived with for decades. You tell yourself the marriage speaks for itself. The decades speak for themselves. And in a way, they do. But there's a difference between love that is understood and love that is heard. And most people, if they're honest, still crave being told even after 50 years, even when they already know. Here is what elders who have lost someone often describe. It is rarely the big fights they replay late at night. It's the small, silent moments, the goodbye at the door that was just see you later, the last phone call that ended the same automatic way it always did. They don't regret what they said. They regret how quickly they said it, how little weight they let it carry, how they assumed there would always be a next time to slow down and mean it more. And many of them confess something harder still, that they had learned this same quiet withholding from their own parents, and had gone on to pass it down to their own children without ever meaning to, simply because it was the only shape of love they'd ever been taught. If a name has already come into your mind while you've been listening, that is not a coincidence. That's something in you trying to answer the question before I've even finished asking it. That's not foolishness. That's love that never quite found the door it was looking for. You don't need a special occasion for this one. You don't need a birthday, a holiday, or a diagnosis to finally say what you've been circling around for years. You only need today and a little bit of courage you already have, whether you feel it yet or not. And here is something worth knowing before you make that call. Even when someone already knows they're loved, hearing it out loud still changes something in them. It isn't redundant. It never is. Maybe you've held back for a different reason too. The fear that saying it suddenly, after years of not saying it, will alarm the other person, make them wonder if something is wrong, if there's news you haven't shared yet. That fear is understandable, but it's usually unfounded. People rarely respond to an unexpected, "I love you," with suspicion. Far more often, there's a small pause on the other end of the line, and then something in their voice softens, and they say it back, and neither of you mentions how long it had been since the last time. If the words genuinely won't come out loud, even after everything we've just talked through, that's all right too. Write them down instead. A short note left on a kitchen counter. A card mailed for no particular reason. The words matter far more than the method they arrive by. What matters least of all is whether they were spoken perfectly, in the perfect setting, at the perfect moment. What matters is that they finally arrived. Reason number 2 is a quieter thief, and it hides in places most people never think to look. Old arguments that were never quite resolved, just left to gather dust. You know the one. A sibling you haven't spoken to since a disagreement whose original cause you can barely remember. A friend who said something careless 15 years ago that you've never fully let go of. A parent whose choices still sting, even now, even after everything. Sometimes it isn't even one large wound. Sometimes it's an inheritance divided in a way that felt unfair. A comment made at a family dinner that nobody else even remembers. A decision about caring for an aging relative that split a family cleanly down the middle and never quite healed. Forgiveness gets postponed for reasons that feel perfectly logical in the moment. You tell yourself you're waiting for an apology and that it's only fair to wait. They were the one who caused the hurt, after all, so shouldn't they be the one to fix it? You tell yourself you're too busy, that this is a conversation for another day when things are calmer. You tell yourself that time will soften it naturally, that eventually it just won't matter anymore. But here's the truth almost nobody warns you about. Unaddressed hurt doesn't fade quietly into the background of your life. Calcifies. It becomes part of the architecture of who you are, a load-bearing wall you built without meaning to, and after enough decades you can hardly imagine your identity without it. This is one of the strange, sad discoveries that comes with age. Many elders reach their final years still gripping a resentment that began as a small disagreement, sometimes over something almost embarrassingly minor. The original wound has long since healed. What remains is only the scar tissue of pride, the refusal to be the one who reaches out first. And pride, it turns out, is a remarkably expensive thing to carry for 30 years. It costs you sleep some nights, it costs you a seat at a wedding or a funeral, it costs you the chance to know who that person eventually became, because people do change given enough time, and you might not even recognize the version of them you're still angry at. You know the small tax it collects even now, the tension in your shoulders every time their name comes up at a family gathering. The rehearsed politeness you perform in front of everyone else, careful and controlled, so no one asks questions you don't want to answer. The private replay of the old argument that still surfaces sometimes, late at night, decades after it happened, as if some part of you is still trying to win a debate the other person may not even remember having. It shows up, too, in the holidays where two branches of the same family sit at separate tables, in the wedding invitations quietly left off the list, in the grandchildren who grow up sensing there's a name nobody says out loud without ever being told exactly why. Forgiveness is often misunderstood as something you offer to the other person, a gift they have to earn or deserve. But that's not really what it is. Forgiveness is what you do for the weight in your own chest. It doesn't require the other person to apologize, to understand, or even to know it happened. It only requires you to set the weight down. You can still choose your boundaries. You can still decide how close you let someone back in, or whether you let them back in at all. Forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing. You can release the grip without reopening the door. You didn't fail by holding on this long. You were only protecting yourself the only way you knew how at the time. But protection that once kept you safe can quietly turn into a cage if you carry it for too long. And most people, when they finally do set it down, don't describe relief so much as they describe lightness. As if they'd forgotten, until that moment, how heavy they'd been walking around for years, how much of their attention had been quietly spent maintaining a grudge they hadn't even chosen to keep anymore, only inherited from an earlier, angrier version of themselves. What might it feel like this week to simply put one of those old weights down? Not because the other person deserves it, but because you do. Now let's talk about a very different kind of postponement, the dream you kept meaning to chase. Did you always want to see a particular place? The country your grandparents came from, perhaps, or an ocean you've only ever seen in photographs? Did you want to learn an instrument you never had time for? Write the book that's been sitting half-finished in a drawer? Take the painting class? Start the small business you used to talk about at the kitchen table with more excitement than you've talked about almost anything since? For most people, there is at least one dream that got quietly filed under when. When the kids are grown. When the mortgage is paid off. When work slows down. When there's more money. When retirement finally comes. It always made sense in the moment. These weren't excuses, they were genuinely reasonable priorities. Providing for a family, building stability, showing up for the responsibilities in front of you. None of that was wrong. But here is what almost nobody tells you about someday. It isn't a date on the calendar. It's a habit of mind. And habits don't disappear just because the circumstances that created them finally do. This is why so many people reach retirement, the very moment they spent decades waiting for, and find, to their own quiet confusion, that the dream still doesn't happen. The trip still doesn't get booked. The paints still sit unopened in the closet. Because the muscle that says not yet, not now, maybe later doesn't get retired along with the job. It has to be unlearned deliberately the same way it was learned. And there's a second, quieter cost to this pattern that rarely gets mentioned. Children notice. Grandchildren notice. They watch you postpone your own joy for 40 years, and without either of you intending it, they learn that this is simply what a responsible life looks like. One where wanting things for yourself always waits its turn behind everything else. Maybe for you it was the ocean. You grew up landlocked, hundreds of miles from any coast, and you told yourself and everyone around you year after year that you'd get there eventually, right after this next busy season, right after the kids' tuition was paid, right after just one more responsibility cleared itself off your plate. And it's a strange thing to notice, if you're honest with yourself right now. How many of those right afters have already come and gone, quietly, without the trip ever actually happening? It's also worth noticing how often people only give themselves permission to chase a long postponed dream after a frightening diagnosis, as though it takes the threat of an ending to finally make the beginning feel urgent enough to matter. That's a shame, because the dream never actually needed permission from mortality. It only ever needed permission from you. There's a particular kind of ache that comes with realizing you spent so many years preparing to live that you forgot, somewhere along the way, to actually live. Not because you were lazy, and not because you didn't care. Usually it's the opposite. You cared so much about doing right by everyone else that your own wants quietly moved to the bottom of the list year after year, until they nearly disappeared from view altogether. That's not selfishness you're feeling when you think about what you never got around to. That's a part of you that never stopped waiting to be let out. There's also something worth considering about what it teaches the people watching you. A grandchild who sees you finally book the trip, finally sign up for the class, finally do the thing you talked about for 30 years, learns a lesson no lecture could ever teach as effectively. That a life well lived doesn't mean a life where every want was postponed in favor of duty. It means one where duty was honored, and joy eventually got its turn too. That may end up being a more valuable inheritance than almost anything else you could leave behind. Here's the encouraging part. Dreams don't actually have an expiration date the way we assume they do. People have learned instruments in their 70s. People have seen the ocean for the first time in their 80s. The version of the dream might look different now than it did at 25, and that's all right. It was never really about the exact shape of it. It was about finally saying yes to something just because you wanted it, with no other justification required. Reason number 4 sits right next door to the last one, though it wears a much quieter disguise. The idea that rest has to be earned before you're allowed to have it. Maybe you grew up in a household where sitting still looked like laziness. Maybe you were taught, in ways nobody ever said out loud but everybody understood, that your worth was tied directly to how much you produced in a day. Meals made, floors cleaned, bills paid, shifts worked, children raised. Rest was something you got only after everything else was finished. And for most people, everything else is never finished. There's always one more thing. So the rest kept getting pushed to tomorrow. And tomorrow brought its own list. This is especially common among people who lived through hard times, a childhood shaped by real financial hardship, a household still carrying the habits of wartime rationing, years of genuine precarity where slowing down truly could mean falling behind in ways that had serious consequences. That caution kept you safe once. Probably kept your whole family afloat. But caution, once it becomes identity, doesn't know how to turn itself off just because the danger has passed. Many people carry the vigilance of their hardest years long into decades where it's no longer required, feeling guilty the moment they sit still, as if rest were something they were stealing rather than something they were owed. It's part of why so many people fill their retirement to the brim the moment it arrives, volunteering every day of the week, taking on every grandchild pickup, saying yes to every request. Not necessarily because they love being that busy, but because an empty afternoon still feels, somewhere in the body, like danger. There's nothing wrong with staying active, and helping family is a genuine gift, not a burden to avoid. But it's worth asking yourself, honestly, whether every commitment on your calendar was chosen because you wanted it, or because an open afternoon felt too uncomfortable to simply let sit there, unfilled. Here's what nobody tells you until much later. Rest was never actually a reward for finishing. It was always a requirement for continuing. You don't rest because the work is done. You rest so that you remain a person, and not just a function. There's nothing weak about needing to sit down. There's only permission you were never given, and that you are allowed to give yourself now. And rest, it's worth saying, isn't only physical. There's an emotional version of it too, the rest of no longer carrying everyone else's worries as though they were automatically yours to solve. Watching a grandchild play in the yard instead of noticing every dish left in the sink. Letting a quiet afternoon simply be quiet, instead of scanning it for the next thing that needs fixing. That kind of rest is often harder to grant yourself than the physical kind, because it can feel, at first, like you're letting go of something important. Mostly, you're only letting go of a weight you were never actually required to keep carrying alone. Now, if you're still with me, I want to pause for a moment and ask you something directly. Of the reasons we've talked about so far, the words left unsaid, the grudge still gripped tight, the dream still waiting in the closet, the rest you never quite let yourself take. Has one of them already found its way under your skin? You don't need to answer out loud. Just notice it, and let yourself sit with it for a moment instead of rushing past it the way you might rush past an uncomfortable thought on an ordinary day. This is exactly the kind of noticing that usually gets postponed too, along with everything else on this list. Because the reasons ahead go even deeper, and I have a feeling at least one of them is going to feel like it was written specifically about your life. Let's keep going. Reason number 5 is one that surprises people because it sounds almost identical to reason number 2, and yet it isn't quite the same thing at all. Postponing reconciliation, not with someone you're angry at, but with someone you simply drifted away from. Is there a friend you used to talk to every single week, who somehow became a name you haven't dialed in 3, 5, 10 years? Not because of a fight. Not because of any single dramatic moment. Just life, a move, a new job, small children, aging parents, the ordinary avalanche of responsibilities that buries even the relationships we care about most. One missed call at a time. Maybe you still see her updates online now and then, a photo of a grandchild, a holiday card once a year, and it lets you tell yourself that the friendship is still intact, just quiet, when really seeing someone's life from a distance isn't the same as being in it. Drift is sneaky precisely because there's no clear moment to point to and say, That's when it ended. There's no apology owed, no clear wrong to right, which paradoxically makes it harder to reach back out, not easier. When there's been a fight, at least there's a script, you know roughly what needs to be said. But when there's only silence built out of years of good intentions and bad timing, reaching out can feel strange, almost intrusive, as if too much time has passed for it to be welcome anymore. It rarely happens all at once. It happens one postponed visit at a time. A move to a different city, a new job that swallows your evenings, small children who need you every waking hour, an aging parent who needs you the rest of the time. And underneath all of it sits a quiet, comfortable assumption that a friendship built over 20 or 30 years is somehow sturdy enough to survive on its own, without maintenance, the way a stone bridge doesn't need daily attention to remain standing. But friendships aren't stone. They're closer to gardens. Even the ones with the deepest roots need a little tending now and then, or the silence grows over them so gradually that nobody quite notices until it's been years. But here's the harder truth underneath that fear. The other person is very often thinking the exact same thing about you, at the exact same time, for the exact same reasons. Both of you assuming the door has closed. Both of you wrong. Elders who have reconnected with an old friend after years of silence rarely describe it as awkward. They describe it, again and again, as if no time had passed at all. As though the friendship had simply been paused, not ended, and picking it back up took nothing more than a single phone call neither of them had quite dared to make. Some of them say the conversation picked up mid-sentence, in a manner of speaking, the same easy rhythm they had 30 years earlier, as though the friendship had been waiting patiently the entire time for someone to simply knock. It rarely takes a grand gesture to test the water either. A single text, a photograph from years ago with a simple line underneath. I found this and thought of you. Nothing that demands an elaborate response. Nothing that requires either of you to explain the years of silence. Just a small, low-stakes knock on a door you're not even sure is still there. More often than not, it turns out it was never locked at all. That's not a failed friendship you're carrying. That's a friendship still waiting on hold. What would it cost you to find out if the line is still open? Reason number 6 is the postponement of something that sounds like it shouldn't need permission at all, and yet almost everyone delays it anyway, joy itself. You know the pattern. I'll be happy when I lose the weight. I'll relax when the house is paid off. I'll enjoy myself once the grandkids are a little older, once my health improves, once things finally settle down. Joy gets placed on the other side of some condition, some finish line that keeps redrawing itself further away the closer you get to it. The trouble with conditional joy is that the conditions rarely arrive all at once, cleanly, the way we picture them. Life doesn't hand you a single finished, tidy moment where everything is perfectly in order and you're finally free to feel good. It hands you an ongoing series of imperfect, complicated, in-between moments, which is, in fact, the entire substance of a life. If joy is only allowed once every condition is met, most people spend the whole of it waiting in a lobby for a meeting that never quite gets called. And even when a condition is finally met, the house really does get paid off, the health scare really does resolve well. The habit of withholding joy usually doesn't dissolve along with it. A new condition simply takes its place, quietly, almost without your noticing the substitution. Picture someone who spent 30 years working toward one clear, honest goal: paying off the house. Every extra dollar went toward it. Every small indulgence got set aside for after. And then, one ordinary afternoon, the final payment clears, and the relief lasts about a week before a new condition quietly slides into its place. Now it's the roof that needs replacing before they can relax. Now it's the retirement account that needs to grow a little more. The house got paid off. The permission to finally enjoy it never actually arrived, because it was never really about the house at all. It was about a habit of vigilance that had nothing left to guard against, but hadn't yet learned how to stand down. Many elders describe a peculiar late-life discovery, that the moments they now miss the most weren't the milestones they were straining toward. They were the ordinary Tuesday afternoons they were too preoccupied to notice at the time. A child's laugh in the next room, a slow cup of coffee, a conversation with a spouse who is no longer there to have it with. They didn't fail to notice these moments because the moments weren't good enough. They failed to notice them because they were too busy waiting for a better one to arrive. That doesn't make you ungrateful. It makes you someone who was taught, somewhere along the way, that joy has to be justified before it's allowed. It doesn't. It never did. And the way back to it is usually smaller than people expect. It isn't a grand gesture or a complete change of philosophy. It's noticing on purpose one ordinary good thing today, the way the light comes through the window in the afternoon, the taste of a meal you didn't have to cook yourself, a voice on the phone you're glad to hear, and letting yourself feel good about it without immediately asking whether you've earned it. Reason number 7 might be the most personal one of all, and I want you to sit with it honestly for a moment. Postponing your own self-acceptance. Have you spent years waiting to like yourself? Waiting until you were thinner, more accomplished, more patient, less prone to the mistakes you've made, waiting for some future, improved version of yourself to finally arrive before you'd allow the current version a little peace. This one runs deep because for most people it started early, sometimes in childhood, shaped by a critical remark that stuck longer than it was ever meant to, a comparison to a sibling who seemed to do everything more easily, a single offhand comment about your appearance or your intelligence that somehow outlasted decades of evidence to the contrary. And once that inner voice takes root, it rarely stays confined to childhood. It follows you through your 30s, your 50s, your 70s, quietly narrating every mistake, every perceived shortcoming, keeping a ledger of everything you should have done differently, while conveniently forgetting almost everything you did well. Here is something remarkable that many people only discover very late in life, and I want you to have the chance to discover it sooner. The harsh inner voice was never actually protecting you. It felt like protection, like staying alert, staying humble, staying sharp enough to avoid future failure, but mostly it was just suffering, dressed up to look useful. And the strange, quiet grief that so many elders carry is not that they made mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. It's that they spent so many decades refusing themselves the simple kindness they extended so freely to everyone else. The friend they'd never speak to the way they speak to themselves, the child they'd never judge as harshly as they judge their own younger self, looking back. There's a particular kind of humility that gets mistaken for virtue in this, the idea that being hard on yourself is simply modesty, simply staying grounded. But there's a real difference between staying grounded and quietly punishing yourself for decades over things almost no one else even remembers. And this is the part that catches so many people off guard, usually far later than they wish it had. When they finally ask the people who love them directly what they actually thought of them all those years, the answer is almost never the harsh verdict they'd been carrying in private. Most of the time, the people who loved you were never keeping the ledger you were so sure they were keeping. You were the only one holding it. You are allowed to stop waiting for permission to be at peace with who you are. As the writer Henry David Thoreau put it so simply, live the life you have imagined. Not the corrected, edited, apologized for version of it. The one you actually lived, mistakes included. That's not weakness. That's the most honest kind of courage there is, the courage to stop auditioning for your own approval. A small, strange exercise if you're willing to try it. The next time that old critical voice starts its familiar speech, ask yourself whether you would ever say those same words to someone you love. If the answer is no, and it almost always is, that's not a small inconsistency. That's proof the voice was never actually telling you the truth. It was only ever telling you the oldest habit it knew. Reason number 8 is one that tends to hit hardest for people who have spent a lifetime being the strong one. Postponing vulnerability, and specifically postponing the simple act of asking for help. Maybe you were the one everyone leaned on, the one who held the family together, who never let anyone see you struggle, who prided yourself on never being a burden. Somewhere along the way, needing help quietly became tangled up with weakness in your mind, and asking for it started to feel like admitting failure. This shows up in small ways at first. Not mentioning that the stairs have gotten harder. Not telling anyone how quiet the evenings have become since the house grew empty. Waving off offers of help with a cheerful, "Oh, I'm fine, don't worry about me." Even when you are, in fact, not entirely fine. Maybe you've had a fall you never told anyone about, brushed it off as clumsiness, because admitting it happened felt like admitting something larger about how your life has changed. And it can persist for years, even decades, this quiet insistence on managing everything alone, because independence became such a core part of your identity that surrendering even a little of it feels like surrendering yourself entirely. This is especially common after losing a spouse, when the house goes quiet in a way it never has before, and the evenings stretch out long and empty. Children call to check in, and the answer is always the same cheerful, "I'm doing just fine." even on the nights that are anything but fine. Not because it's a lie exactly, but because saying anything else feels like handing someone else a problem, and handing people your problems was never something you learned how to do gracefully. So the loneliness stays private. The hard days stay private. And the people who would have given almost anything to help never get the chance, simply because they were never told there was a chance to give. But here's what so many people only come to understand very late. Asking for help was never actually the opposite of strength. It takes a particular kind of courage to say, "I can't do this alone," out loud. Far more courage, often, than it takes to silently struggle and call it resilience. The people who love you are not waiting for you to be flawless and self-sufficient. Most of them are waiting for the chance to be let in, to be trusted with something real, to matter to you in the way you have always mattered to them. Being needed, for the people who love you, is rarely a burden. Far more often, it's a gift they've been quietly hoping you would offer. Accepting help, it turns out, is its own skill separate from giving it, and most people who were raised to be caretakers were never actually taught this second half. They can organize a meal train for a struggling neighbor without a second thought, but freeze up completely at the idea of letting someone bring them a casserole in return. If that sounds familiar, know that it's not a character flaw. It's simply a skill you never had reason to practice, and like any skill, it gets easier the more you allow yourself to try it. There's nothing shameful about needing someone. There's only the story you were told a long time ago that convinced you otherwise. What might it feel like to let just one person in this week? Not with the whole burden all at once, but with a single, honest sentence. Reason number 9, the last one, is perhaps the gentlest of all, and yet it might be the one that stings the most in hindsight. Postponing gratitude. Think of the people who shaped you. A teacher who believed in you before you believed in yourself. A parent who sacrificed more than you understood at the time. A friend who showed up during the hardest year of your life without ever being asked. A spouse who stayed through years that weren't easy for either of you. Did you ever tell them plainly and directly what they meant to you? Or did you save it for a card at their funeral, for a toast at some future celebration, for a someday conversation you kept meaning to have when the moment felt right? Most of us treat gratitude like a formal occasion, something that requires the right setting, a milestone birthday, an anniversary, a eulogy. We write the heartfelt words down eventually, but often only after the person is no longer there to read them, which is one of the quiet cruelties of how we've been taught to handle thankfulness. We save our best words for the moment it's too late for them to land where they were always meant to land. Think of the old teacher who once stayed after class to help you with something you were struggling with decades ago, and never knew how much that 10 minutes ended up shaping the rest of your life. A short letter to a person like that, sent on an entirely unremarkable Tuesday for no occasion at all, tends to mean far more than almost anything you could send them on a milestone birthday, because it proves the memory wasn't manufactured for the moment. Proves you carried it quietly for years and finally decided it was worth saying. But gratitude was never meant to be a grand, formal event. It was only ever meant to be true and said out loud on any ordinary day to the person who is still right there to hear it. And when it finally is said, plainly, without waiting for the perfect occasion, it tends to land far more powerfully than anyone expects, precisely because it wasn't required by any calendar. It was simply true, and someone finally said it out loud while it still mattered most to be heard. And here's something that surprises a lot of people once they finally try it. Expressing gratitude doesn't just change the person receiving it. Changes you too. Naming, specifically and out loud, exactly what someone gave you tends to bring a kind of clarity to your own life that's easy to miss when the good things simply blend into the background of everyday routine. Saying thank you properly is as much an act of noticing your own life as it is a gift to someone else's. That's not something you missed. That's something still entirely within your reach. So here is the pattern underneath all 9 of these, the one single regret wearing 9 different faces. Waiting. Waiting for the right moment, the right words, the right amount of courage, the right circumstances. As though life were going to eventually clear its throat and announce that the waiting period was officially over and it was finally safe to begin. It never does that. It was never going to. Think back to that hospital room we started with, or that empty chair, or that quiet phone. The ache in that moment was never really about what was lost. It was about what was still, right up until the very end, possible. A sentence that could have been spoken, a hand that could have been held a little longer, a call that could have been made. The door was open the entire time. It simply never got walked through. Yours is still open. Whichever of these 9 reasons found its way to you today. The unsaid words, the ungiven forgiveness, the unlived dream, the unclaimed rest, the unmade call, the unallowed joy, the unaccepted self, the unspoken need, the unspoken thanks. None of it is finished yet. Not while you're still here to act on it. You don't have to fix all 9 this week. Just pick one. Send the text. Make the call. Sit down and rest without apologizing for it. Let today be the day someday finally stops winning. Not because you failed by waiting this long, you didn't. You were simply carrying what life handed you the best way you knew how, one day at a time, same as everyone else who has ever lived long enough to look back and see it clearly. The only difference now is that you get to see it before the door closes instead of after. Every single elder who has ever spoken about this regret was, at some point, exactly where you are right now. Sitting somewhere quiet, hearing these words or ones very much like them, and facing the same small choice you're facing this very moment. Some of them acted on it. Some of them meant to and let the moment pass anyway, the same way they'd let so many moments pass before. There is no way to know in advance which kind of person you'll turn out to be. There's only the next small decision in front of you, and what you choose to do with it starting today. Whatever you choose to do with the rest of today, I hope it includes at least a few minutes of gentleness toward yourself. You've carried a great deal to get here, further than you probably give yourself credit for, and the fact that you're still willing to look honestly at your own life, still willing to ask whether there's time to do something differently, says more about your character than any regret on this list ever could. If this found you at the right moment, I'd love for you to stay a while longer. I make these reflections because I believe a long life deserves to be looked at honestly, gently, and without rushing past the parts that matter most. If you'd like to sit with me again next time, just tap subscribe. I'll be right here whenever you're ready to come back.